April 6, 1945. The first convoy left Berlin before dawn. 2 trucks, wooden crates, paintings wrapped and packed by the museum staff of the Nationalgalerie, the principal gallery of German and European art, which had spent 5 centuries accumulating the greatest works of Western painting available to a German state. The drivers headed west through a city that Soviet artillery had been shelling for days. By April 7th, the second convoy had followed. The Reich was functionally over. Berlin had maybe 4 weeks left as an organized entity. The people loading paintings onto trucks in the dark knew this. They loaded them anyway, because the alternative was leaving them to burn in the museum buildings or be seized by the Red Army. And neither option was acceptable to German museum professionals who had spent careers in service to those collections. Their destination was a hole in the ground near Helmstedt in Lower Saxony, a working rock salt mine called Grasleben, 100 kilometers east of Hanover and roughly 60 kilometers west of Magdeburg. The mine had been accepting Berlin's evacuated collections since at least March 1944. By the time those last 2 convoys arrived in early April 1945, Grasleben had been receiving crates from Germany's greatest institutions for more than a year. The paintings were lowered underground. The crates were stacked in tunnels where salt had been extracted since 1925. And 5 days after the second convoy arrived, on April 12, 1945, the 117th Regiment of the 30th Infantry Division, operating under the US 9th Army, overran the village above the mine. The soldiers who came down that shaft had spent months fighting across northern Germany. They weren't museum professionals. Nothing in their orders or their training addressed what to do with thousands of crates of cultural property sitting unguarded underground in a dry salt cavern. What they found when they got there, what the darkness held, what their flashlights would have illuminated as they moved through the tunnels, has never been described in any document available in the public record. That silence is where this story starts. The Nazis had selected their underground repositories with what German archivists and museum experts formally described, by March 1943, as methodical reasoning. Salt mines were identified as optimal because of a combination of properties that happened to align perfectly with the requirements of art preservation: dry, warm, structurally stable, bomb-proof. The aridity of a salt mine is the same property that preserves paint on canvas across centuries. The same conditions that kept Egyptian mummies intact underground in desert rock, that preserved medieval parchment in monastery cellars. Allied bombing was reducing German cities to rubble above ground. 50 meters of salt rock overhead made a mine as safe as anything available in a country being systematically destroyed from the air. Grasleben, west of Magdeburg, was one of the most significant of these repositories. What they put there reflected the scope of the German state's cultural holdings and the scope of the German state's theft. The Berlin State Museums had been evacuating their collections since the early 1940s, distributing objects across multiple sites as the threat from Allied bombing intensified. Grasleben received a substantial share. Paintings from the Nationalgalerie, objects from the Ägyptisches Museum, the Egyptian Museum, including pieces from the Bab el-Gassus cache, ancient funerary figurines that had survived 3,000 years in the desert and were now being moved underground to survive the 20th century's preferred method of self-destruction. The Islamic department contributed its collection of minor arts, metalwork, carved glass, ceramics, ivory objects that had travelled from the medieval Near East into Berlin's public collections and were making another enforced journey. The sculpture gallery's holdings had been parcelled out to Grasleben alongside Kaiserode, the mine in Thuringia that would become famous when American forces found it in April 1945 alongside the Reich's gold reserves. The Kästner Museum in Hanover was more systematic than most. Between February 2nd and March 30th, 1944, the museum dispatched 6 separate transports, totaling 136 crates. Its Egyptian collection, catalogued and logged on the way out, shipped to Grasleben with the kind of institutional precision that produces records researchers can still follow 80 years later. Materials from the Teutonic Order's archive in Königsberg had made the journey west as the Soviet advance pushed through East Prussia, ending up in the mine. Indian collection pieces from the Berlin State Museums, Gandharan artifacts, cast objects, were sent to Grasleben alongside Kaiserode. More than 2,100 objects from that collection would be lost across the war's final chaos, of which the Grasleben holdings were a portion. The German newsreel archives were there too. The Deutsche Wochenschau, the weekly propaganda film that had narrated German public consciousness for 12 years, packaging the war, the victories, the ideology, along with film materials from the Berlin Film Review Office, had been carried into the mine. Someone in the propaganda apparatus had concluded that the Reich's documentary record of itself was worth preserving, even as the Reich itself collapsed. And then there was the stolen material, commingled with everything else. Artifacts plundered from Polish churches and collections had made the journey to Grasleben. Objects belonging to the Czartoryska family, one of Poland's most significant cultural inheritances, assembled over generations before the German occupation stripped it apart, had been transported deep into the Reich and deposited in the mine. These weren't German cultural property being protected from Allied bombs. They were stolen property, hidden underground in the company of legitimate holdings, waiting to be discovered by armies whose job it would be to figure out the difference. That task, distinguishing what Germany owned from what Germany had taken, was more complicated in the tunnels of Grasleben than it sounds in the abstract. Objects had no labels that declared their origin. Crates were marked with institutional abbreviations that meant nothing to soldiers who had never studied German museum catalogues. The entire project of restitution depended on records that identified what was where, and the records weren't all in one place, and some of them wouldn't survive 1945. The connection between Grasleben and forced labour also shadows the mine's history, though its exact shape isn't fully documented. The nearby village of Biendorf, close to Helmstedt, was home to a satellite camp of the Neuengamme concentration camp, with prisoners used for underground excavation work in local salt mines. The geographic overlap between the forced labour infrastructure and the art storage network in this part of Lower Saxony is established. The precise operational connection between Biendorf's prisoners and the Grasleben mine specifically isn't confirmed in the available record, but it's part of the landscape in which all of this happened. The tunnels that held these paintings had been made by people with no choice about making them. The March 1944 date for Grasleben deposits is significant for another reason. That same month, the German cultural establishment was also moving important material from the Flakturm Friedrichshain, the massive Berlin flak tower that had become an emergency art repository, to Grasleben and to other mines. A documented chronicle of what happened at Friedrichshain notes those shipments explicitly. The material that left Friedrichshain in time made it to the mines. The US 9th Army's 117th Regiment secured Grasleben on April 12, 1945. The regiment's parent division was moving fast. General William H. Simpson's 9th Army entered Magdeburg just 6 days later, on April 18th. These were the weeks of maximum operational speed in northern Germany, the Allied advance finally converting years of grinding attrition into something that looked like collapse. Combat soldiers weren't stopping to catalogue salt mines. The MFAA, the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives section, the program whose personnel history would later be curated into the Monuments Men Mythology, was supposed to accompany operations, identify cultural property, and secure it against exactly this kind of uncontrolled discovery. In practice, as of mid-December 1944, the total MFAA field strength under SHAEF direction was 16 officers. 16 people for the cultural heritage of a continent being overrun at speed.
German academic literature would later describe the MFAA's inclusion in the Allied command structure as something close to a miracle, given the institutional resistance to it. Something of a miracle is the phrase used by one German scholarly account of the program. 16 officers was the miracle's output. There is no document in the available record of a formal US MFAA inventory of Grasleben conducted in the days or weeks after the 117th Regiment arrived. No named American officer is recorded as having entered the mine, assessed its contents, and produced a catalogue of what was there. This isn't necessarily because it didn't happen. It may be that such documentation exists in American military archives and has simply not surfaced in the scholarship available here. What is established is that when British custody eventually produced its own accounting of Grasleben, the discrepancy between what should have been there and what was found was a problem with no clear attribution. Grasleben fell within the British occupation zone of Germany. The US Ninth Army had captured it, but administrative responsibility would transfer to British control as the occupation boundaries crystallized. Between April 12th, when American soldiers secured the mine, and the late summer of 1945, when British authority was fully established, the mine existed in a condition of transitional custody. American soldiers knew it was there. British military administration was taking shape. The MFAA's 16 officers had competing priorities across hundreds of kilometres, and the mine sat underground, accessible, full of objects that any individual with the knowledge and the opportunity could remove without anyone counting. One consequence of this period is documented from a parallel site. The crates from Grasleben, or at least a portion of them, began moving on May 14, 1945, when transport records placed the first documented transfer out of the mine. These weren't being moved under full MFAA supervision to a secure collecting point. They were moving through the logistics infrastructure of an army in the process of transitioning from combat to occupation. The supply chain that had been built to move ammunition and rations and fuel was now also moving priceless art, and nobody had specifically adapted it for that purpose. Allied looting of defeated Germany wasn't a marginal phenomenon. It was widespread, and in practice largely tolerated at the level where it actually happened. Occupation soldiers helped themselves to valuables in ways that ranged from pocket-sized opportunism, a small bronze, a piece of silver, a rolled canvas tucked into a duffel bag, to more systematic removal. The MFAA officers who cared most about proper restitution were also the officers most specifically aware of what their own side was doing. The gap between the official policy, cultural property is to be protected and returned, and what was happening on the ground was visible to anyone paying attention. And the officers paying attention were often the same ones writing reports that circulated within a military system not designed to punish its own members for what it treated as collateral behaviour. Robert Lonsdale Charles, Rollo to colleagues, arrived in Germany on August 5, 1945, as the British Zone's appointed Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives officer. That date places him at Grasleben, roughly 4 months after the 117th Regiment took the mine.
His inspection of the site would become, in the words of the art newspaper, the principal British documentation of what conditions were like. The art newspaper published an account of this period under the headline "The Sacking of Germany." Charles had written a report. That report described what he found. What he found included hundreds of uncrated pictures from Berlin's Nationalgalerie, loose in the tunnels. Not crates, not packaged works in their protective shipping containers. Paintings that had arrived sealed and stacked in wooden crates, packed by museum professionals in Berlin who knew exactly what they were handling. Those paintings were now uncrated, loose, exposed. Someone had worked through them. The crates had been opened. The systematic care with which German museum staff had packed these works in 1944 and 1945 had been undone by the time the British officer designated to protect them arrived to find them on the floor of a salt mine. Charles's report described the situation. What it didn't, and perhaps couldn't, establish was precisely when the uncrating happened, or who had done it. The 4 months between April 12th and August 5th contained multiple possible actors: American combat soldiers in the days after capture, occupation personnel in the transition period, individuals with access during the months before Charles arrived. The chain of custody from German museum to salt mine to Allied hands was established. What happened inside that chain, in the gap between the war's end and the British MFAA's arrival, wasn't. Celle Castle, a Renaissance hunting palace roughly 40 kilometres north of Hanover, was where the material from Grasleben was eventually supposed to arrive. The British Zone's Zonal Fine Arts Repository, the central collecting point for the British military administration's art recovery operation, was established there. Objects from Grasleben made the journey to Celle. The Islamic department's metalwork and carved glass and ceramics. The Egyptian Museum's funerary figurines from the Bab el Gassus cache. Pieces whose institutional identity was sufficiently well documented that tracking them was possible. The transit from Berlin to the mine to the British collecting point is documented for those specific objects because they had advocates, curators, scholars, institutional records that survived the war in other locations. The objects without advocates posed a different problem. Paintings have no serial numbers. A rolled canvas from the National Gallery, removed from its crate in a salt mine by a person who understood its market value or simply wanted a souvenir, enters a private collection without a paper trail. It becomes, in the language of post-war restitution, an object whose current location is officially unknown. The phrase does not mean nobody knows. It means no official entity has compelled the knowledge into the public record. Sometime in 1945, a fire broke out in the Grasleben mine. This is confirmed. The Deutsche Kinemathek, Germany's national film museum based in Berlin, investigated the fire's consequences thoroughly enough to construct an entire exhibition around them. They named it Brandspuren, burn marks. The name is precise. It refers to the physical scorch marks left on film negatives that survived the blaze, the evidence of the fire's heat and reach visible on the objects themselves decades later, when researchers at the Kinemathek found them in storage and began the reconstruction. The exhibition exists because the evidence of the fire exists on the surviving materials. You can still see where the heat got close. The German film materials stored at Grasleben were among the confirmed casualties. The Deutsche Wochenschau archive, documents from the Berlin Film Review Office, film negatives and papers that had been carried underground specifically to survive Allied bombing were destroyed in a fire after the war was over, in a mine that was by then under Allied jurisdiction. These were materials that had made it through 6 years of aerial bombardment. They survived the war and burned in the peace. The fire's specific date within 1945 isn't confirmed in what is publicly available. The precise cause, whether it was accidental, a consequence of the mine's industrial infrastructure, or something set deliberately, hasn't been established through documentary evidence available in the public record. What is established is that a fire occurred, that it destroyed confirmed holdings, and that it occurred in a mine under Allied jurisdiction in the same year that those holdings were supposed to be catalogued and returned to their rightful owners or institutions. The epistemological consequence of the fire is significant, regardless of how it started.
A fire in a repository containing objects from dozens of institutions does not burn selectively. It destroys whatever it reaches, and alongside the objects it reaches, it destroys the records that document what was stored alongside them. An inventory compiled before a fire is the only evidence of what the fire consumed. Without a comprehensive pre-fire inventory, the category of destroyed in the fire becomes available as an explanation for any object subsequently found to be missing. The fire's most durable consequence is that it made verification harder. How much harder depended on what records existed before it and what those records covered and whether they were held in locations that survived. The Kinemathek researchers, working from scorch marks on surviving negatives and cross-referenced against whatever institutional records the Berlin film organizations had maintained in other locations, were able to reconstruct a partial picture of what burned. That reconstruction took decades of specialized scholarly effort and is still not complete. For the paintings, the Nationalgalerie works, the objects from the Islamic department and the Ägyptisches Museum and the Kessner collection and the Polish looted holdings, the same reconstruction work faces a more fragmented record base, because the institutional documentation was distributed across Berlin institutions that were themselves in chaos in 1945, in a city divided between four occupying powers. In the summer of 1946, more than a year after the war ended, British troops cleared the Grasleben mine, cleared it entirely. An academic study of provenance disputes around the Teutonic Order's archive from Königsberg references this clearance directly, noting that British troops swiftly cleared the mine in Grasleben in the summer of 1946. The same source states that the British authorities withheld the large holdings discovered in the Grasleben salt mine. Both facts are in the same document. The mine that had experienced a fire, been found to contain uncrated National Gallery paintings, and been the subject of documented MFAA concern, was then systematically emptied by British military personnel. What supervision accompanied that clearance? Whether MFAA officers oversaw it, whether a full inventory was taken, where the remaining contents went, isn't established in the available public record. A mine that burned, then was cleared. Authority exercised, accounting absent. The three British officers who were closest to the Grasleben material during this period weren't anonymous bureaucrats. They were people with expertise, records, and in some cases, prominent subsequent careers that suggest they knew exactly what they had witnessed. Douglas Cooper came to the MFAA with more relevant knowledge than almost anyone in the Allied art recovery structure. He wasn't a soldier handed an art brief. He was a serious art historian and critic who had spent the war learning in forensic detail how a looted collection moves. His MFAA service from November 1944 had been spent in London, interrogating prisoners of war, including Walter Hofer, Hermann Göring's personal art advisor. From those interrogations, Cooper was able to trace substantial amounts of illegally acquired French art that had been shipped to Germany. Hofer, as Göring's man, understood how objects travelled from occupied territories into private German collections, how documentation was managed or suppressed, how provenance was manufactured or obscured.
Cooper extracted that knowledge in a series of sessions that produced a National Archives report. He understood, better than almost any other Allied officer, the mechanics of how valuable art disappears, and why the paperwork makes it difficult to prove.
Then he was deployed to the British Zone, where the British Zone had a mine full of uncrated paintings and a fire that had eliminated whatever records didn't survive it. What Cooper concluded, what he reported, and what happened to those reports afterward isn't fully established in what is publicly available. His subsequent career as a prominent art historian and critic extended well beyond the war. Whether he published specifically on the Grasleben situation, or whether his wartime findings circulated inside the MFAA system and then stopped circulating, the British National Archives can presumably answer. What is publicly established is that he had the expertise to recognize exactly what an incomplete inventory and a convenient fire meant in an art recovery context. The man who had spent months learning how art disappears was then placed in proximity to art that was disappearing. Anne Olivier Popham joined the MFAA in November 1945, recruited at a party. She later described the recruiter as a foppish young man, and she came to it with her own connections to England's cultural establishment. She was associated with the Bloomsbury Group and its extended circle, knew the world these objects inhabited, understood the stakes of the work in ways that a purely military appointment might not have. She joined after the fire, after the most chaotic period of the collection's displacement, when the British collecting point at Celle was already in operation, and the MFAA's role had shifted from emergency recovery to the slower, more bureaucratic work of cataloguing and restitution. She kept diaries throughout her service. Decades later, a researcher working on the history of Nazi art plunder in post-war Western Europe sat down in an archive and read them. The research that emerged from that process, a scholarly study of the collecting points and their administration, records that Popham found British institutional structures harder to navigate than the broader complexities of the restitution mission itself. She encountered obstruction from her own side. The specific nature of that obstruction, the specific requests denied, or reports buried, or questions deflected, is in those diaries. A researcher has read them. What they contain in full is known to very few people, and the diaries haven't been published. Popham lived until July 18, 2018, 102 years old, the last known surviving member of the British MFAA. She had been there. She had written it down. The gap between what she saw and what is publicly known is the width of an archive she left behind and the institutional will required to examine it properly. K. Freemuth published his research on the Grasleben situation in 1989. German academic literature describes his contribution in terms that, in the careful register of that scholarly tradition, amount to a significant endorsement. His 1989 publication is described as particularly noteworthy among the contributions to the subject. The German phrase used, besonders hervorzuheben ist die Veröffentlichung von K. Freemuth, isn't routine academic courtesy. It's a specific elevation of one work above a field of others. A researcher who subsequently worked on tracing missing Berlin art collections described working alongside Freemuth, pursuing the question through correspondence with museum colleagues. What Freemuth's 1989 work specifically concluded, what evidence he assembled, what argument he made about the fire and what followed, is referenced in the scholarly literature but not reproduced in full in what is publicly available. His book exists. His conclusions are awaiting anyone who looks. The German academic question at the center of this scholarship asks it plainly. Die Besatzer als Kuratoren, the occupiers as curators. The paper with that title wasn't asking rhetorically.
It was asking as an open research question, with documented evidence on both sides. The occupation forces who took control of Germany's repositories were simultaneously the programme's administrators and its potential plunderers. And the British zone at Grasleben and Celle is one of the specific cases where the available evidence pulls against the heroic framing. The Monuments Men mythology was built around different cases. Merkers, where the 90th Infantry Division in April 1945 found a potash mine in Thuringia containing the Reichsbank's gold reserves alongside thousands of objects from the Berlin State Museums. Gold, silver, and art that was transferred into protective American custody and subsequently restituted. Outersee in Austria, where American MFAA officers discovered that SS commanders had placed explosive charges inside the mine, alongside the Ghent altarpiece and Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna and Vermeer's The Astronomer, and works from the Rothschild collections, and hundreds of other masterpieces. And where MFAA officer George Stout, working with local Austrian salt miners who had already been trying to remove the explosives, secured the mine before the charges could be detonated. These recoveries were real. The people who achieved them risked actual lives. The mythology didn't manufacture heroes from nothing. The 2014 film, directed by George Clooney, which drew on Robert Edsel's 2009 book of the same name, presented this story to an audience of millions as a straightforward account of Allied heroism in service of human civilization. The film's reception did what Hollywood does to historical complexity. It simplified the cast into clear moral roles, ended the story at the moment of discovery, and left the audience with the impression that the Monuments Men saved Europe's art. Full stop. What the film does not depict is August 5, 1945, and Robert Lonsdale Charles arriving in Grasleben to find Nationalgalerie paintings uncrated on the tunnel floor. It does not show the correspondence in which Anne Olivier Popham documents her frustration with British institutional structures. It does not show Kay Friemut in a German archive in the late 1980s, working through documents that had been sitting untouched for 40 years, producing research that his colleagues would describe as particularly noteworthy. It does not show the summer of 1946, with British troops clearing the mine, and the question of where everything went remaining, as it remains now, without a full public answer. The mythology stops at the moment of triumph, because that is where a myth serves its purpose. The Grasleben story does not stop there. In November and December 1998, representatives of 44 governments gathered in Washington for the Conference on Holocaust-era Assets. The Washington Principles on Nazi-confiscated art that emerged from those sessions established a framework built on a specific moral logic. That the wartime looting of art from Jewish families and institutions had created ongoing injustices that post-war legal frameworks had failed to resolve, and that participating nations were committing themselves to active provenance research, publicly accessible findings, and the pursuit of just and fair solutions. Britain was among the signatories. A decade later, in 2009, the UK passed the Holocaust Return of Cultural Objects Act, which gave national museums the legal power to deaccession items for restitution, something the default position of UK museums law had previously prevented. The legislative implementation followed the moral commitment. The Washington Principles are primarily concerned with a specific category of victim: Jewish families and institutions whose property was confiscated by the Nazi state, whose heirs can potentially be identified, whose provenance chains can be reconstructed from records of the looting. The Grasleben material maps onto that framework unevenly. Some of it fits.
The Polish looted holdings, the objects taken from churches, from the Czartoryska collection, from the cultural patrimony of an occupied country whose citizens had no recourse, belong in a restitution framework. And there are Polish institutions that have spent decades trying to reconstruct exactly what was taken and where it went. Objects traceable to Jewish-owned collections looted under the ERR or through the art market mechanisms the Nazi state had corrupted fall within the principle's core scope. For those works, the Washington framework creates a clear obligation. Find them, identify them, return them. Some of the Grasleben material is German state art, and that category is different. The Berlin State Museums have been cataloguing their wartime losses for decades. The Nationalgalerie's records, which institutions contributed what, which works were packed into which convoys, what arrived where, are the product of persistent institutional effort to reconstruct the collection's wartime trajectory. The paintings that left Berlin in those last two convoys on April 6th and 7th, 1945, and arrived at Grasleben 5 days before the 117th Regiment took the mine. Some of those works have been repatriated in the decades since. Germany knows which ones haven't come back. The Staatliche Museen zu Berlin maintains the documentation. Whether the ones found uncrated by Charles in August 1945 are among the recovered or the unrecovered isn't established in publicly available records. Germany wants to know. The question is whether Britain has been forthcoming with what the British archives hold. The Deutsche Kinemathek is still working. Their Brandspuren exhibition, Burn Marks, is an ongoing institutional investigation, not a closed historical verdict. Researchers at the Kinemathek have been cross-referencing scorch marks on surviving film negatives against institutional records from the Berlin film organizations, attempting to reconstruct what burned and what survived by burning. The work is slow, technical and specialist, and it has been proceeding for years. German scholars working on the broader question of displaced Berlin collections have been corresponding with each other and with museum professionals since before the Berlin Wall came down. Friemuth's 1989 publication was a milestone, not an endpoint. The question is still open among the people with the expertise to pursue it. The gap isn't on the German side. Britain signed the Washington Principles in 1998, committing to active provenance research and publicly accessible findings. The British National Archives hold the MFAA records from the British zone of occupation. The reports filed by officers like Charles, the administrative documentation from Celle Castle, the correspondence that moved through the MFAA chain of command as the British collecting point worked through its holdings. What a thorough Grasleben-specific examination of those records would reveal. Whether it would resolve the accounting that has been absent for 80 years isn't publicly established. No parliamentary inquiry has subjected the British MFAA's administration to scrutiny proportionate to what the available evidence suggests is warranted. No British government statement has specifically addressed the Grasleben discrepancies in the context of the commitments made in 1998. This isn't a claim that Britain looted Grasleben and is hiding the evidence. The evidence for what happened in that mine between April 1945 and the summer of 1946, when British troops cleared it, is incomplete. Incomplete in ways that the fire, the gap in custody, and the documented uncrating of the Nationalgalerie paintings all help explain. But incomplete nonetheless. What can be stated with confidence is this. A significant quantity of cultural property passed through British custody at Grasleben and Celle Castle. Some of it's known to have arrived at its destination. Some of it hasn't been publicly accounted for.
The British archives that could close that gap haven't been opened for this specific purpose, in public, in a way that has produced a result. The paintings that left Berlin on April 6th and 7th, 1945, packed in the dark by museum staff who understood exactly what they were doing, arrived in a mine, went through a fire, had their crates opened by persons unknown, and were found loose in the tunnels by a British officer 4 months after an American regiment took the ground above. Some of them came back. All of them should have. The accounting for where the others went has never been made public. The archives that could produce it remain, as far as can be established, unexamined for this specific question. And the British government that signed a commitment in 1998 to active provenance research and just solutions has, in the 8 decades since the war ended, chosen not to apply that commitment to the Grasleben question with the transparency it would require. The German scholars' question, Die Besatzer als Kuratoren, has been sitting in the academic literature since 1989. It translates plainly as, were the occupiers curators, or were they something else? It asks whether the forces that took possession of Germany's greatest cultural repository protected what they found, or treated it as a resource. The question has been available for answer for longer than most of the people asking it have been alive. Britain has chosen, so far, not to answer it. Subscribe for more stories like this.